Hey, welcome to Plant Sunlight Therapy, and today we're going to be talking about the philodendron, specifically a philodendron that I rescued about a year and some odd months ago. But first, here's a review. The philodendron is a vining plant from South America. This specific cultivar is called the Brasil, so I assume it's from Brazil. These plants are similar to the pothos, but the pothos originated in the South Pacific on an island near Tahiti. Although these plants originated thousands of miles apart, the care of these plants are practically the same. These plants require bright indirect light, but they can do fine in low light conditions found in many households, and they can survive short periods of direct sunlight. But many times direct sunlight will damage these plants. They are not particular on soil, but they require well-draining soil. And like all house plants, water this plant only when dry. A lot of people don't fertilize this plant. I use organic fertilizer, but if you use chemical fertilizer, dilute it and use it sparingly. This is a plant that I got from a friend about a year and some odd months ago. A few commenters criticized that I should have just left this plant alone and it would have been fine, but it was my decision at the time to repot this plant. I trimmed all of this plant's long vines so this plant didn't have to expend any more energy than it had to, and it could focus all its energy on healing. And although these plants like to be root bound, I trimmed most of these roots. I've been told that you're not supposed to trim more than 30%, but I trimmed more than 50%. I figured this vining plant easily roots so it could handle it, and it did. These plants prefer well-draining soil, so nowadays I just use potting mix with perlite. I don't get complicated with my soil recipe anymore. I top the pot with a layer of only potting mix because perlite floats, and after a few waterings there's going to be a layer of perlite on the top. Then I placed this plant in an area where it could get bright indirect sunlight, and the plant did very well and eventually fully recovered. This is the plant about a month after I repotted it, and it looks great. The leaves are all green and firm and standing up. There's new leaves forming on the end of the vines. It was a little thin on top, but in general I was very happy with the progress of this plant. A few weeks later, this plant was able to grow vines, but it still looked a little straggly, so I trimmed the vines. And then a few weeks or maybe months after that, this plant really filled out nicely. I was very surprised and happy of how this plant turned out. It really gave me a sense of accomplishment. These plants are all propagated from the vines that I trimmed from the original plant. These plants I propagated mostly by water, some by soil, and they all grew into very beautiful plants. I must have propagated and made about a dozen of these plants. Many of them my friends liked, so I gave them away. But I had these plants all over my house because they are beautiful and they can tolerate low light. However, they'll turn green if you keep them in low light conditions. They need a bright indirect light source to maintain the beautiful variegations. This is how I propagated the vines. The leaf attaches to the vine, and under each leaf there's a node. So I cut the stem about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch away from the node, and this is my clipping that I propagated in water. After a few weeks, and this is about a month later, roots developed, and this is when I placed them in soil. I've been told that some of these clippings that develop water roots in water have a difficult time transitioning to soil, and I'm glad I didn't know this because that would have been just another thing to worry about. I never had any problems with these plants transitioning to soil, at least for pothos and philodendrons. This is a few weeks later, and the plants don't look great, but they're still alive, and they look pretty good for their progression. The leaves are all standing up. There's no dead, droopy, soggy vines. Some of the vines are growing new leaves, while other leaves just seem to be just sitting there, but they're not brown, they're not mushy, they're still alive, which means they're still growing. These philodendrons are very sturdy plants. A couple of these clippings I just placed in a cup with soil and they grew. I just kept them in an area where they get bright indirect light and I left them alone. A few months after that, this happened. This plant is a beautiful plant, and look at these colors. Look at these leaves. These are very beautiful plants that I have all over my house. Well, I used to have all over my house, and a lot of my friends like these plants, so I just gave them to them because they're so easy to propagate. These plants also are very good for purifying the indoor air, takes out carcinogenic gases like benzene, styrene, and all those other gases that form from our modern living conditions. And though another commenter criticized that I'm going to need a ton of plants to purify the air, well, I don't live in a biodome. I still have fresh air from the outside. But even if this plant only purifies 50% of the air in the house, or even 25% of the air in the house, that's still better than not having any of the air in my house purified. Of course, it's going to need more than just one plant to purify even 50% of the air in my house, but something is better than nothing. And furthermore, these plants are beautiful. They look nice. They make your house look nice. They make your house feel fresh. But I have to admit, one of the best things about these plants is the ease of care and maintenance. This is my presentation and update on the philodendron that I propagated and rescued about a year and some odd months ago. I hope this information to be useful and practical. Thank you for watching. Aloha.